Today we're going to be talking about strikes that happened as a result of the tension between the upper class and the lower class during the Industrial Revolution. You can tell that because of the living conditions, because of the issues with labor and the fact that people are living in such awful conditions, and at the same time there's this like super elite that's living, this unbelievable life. And just spending money rampantly, owning many homes, and things, technologies that many people don't have access to. Obviously, there's going to be some sort of tension. So our question is, how did Americans feel about labor unions? And this is a really important question in terms of the popular opinion, in terms of the success of labor unions. If the American people don't like labor unions, that just adds to the fact that their bosses don't like them. The government doesn't like them because labor unions make things slower. They make business people unhappy. And when business people are unhappy, they turn to the government to fix it. And so if we add the public doesn't like labor unions either, you can just see that unions have historically been under attack. And so we want to know, during sort of the glory age of labor unions, what was popular opinion about them then? So it's important to understand that what types of strikes are available to people. So there's something called a walkout, and that's where you're doing work and everybody at a scheduled time just walks out of work. Like, I refuse to do what you are asking me to do. A sit-in is essentially the opposite. You are occupying your place of business and you're not letting your bosses in or out. Or sit-ins were used, or sit-ins, you could also call them lock-ins, which is essentially what I described. Sit-ins are again used during the civil rights movement by African Americans and others in the South protesting segregation. So we'll talk about that later. Slowdowns is basically where you slow down your work, okay? And the next one is just destroying the means of production so that you can't work. It's another way of protesting your boss. We can see these a lot in school. If something that a teacher's doing offends somebody, they walk out of the classroom. Hopefully not, but it's an example. It's happened. Sit-ins, this is an example of, we see this a lot. Maybe teachers not getting locked out of classrooms, hopefully, but sitting and in protest, that has happened. I think there was a planned one on Earth Day. Slowdowns is basically not slowing down your work so that the teacher can't add more and things like that. So we see these types of strikes in schools, and so this is just on a big scale in work. So the first strike that we need to talk about is the Great Railroad Strike, and can see from this sketch that it was in fact a great strike. This happened in Virginia in 1877, so after Reconstruction. The wages of the railroad employees were cut. And so they were making less money, and they were cut for, budget purposes. They were cut to make sure that, the company had enough to pay everybody. And so for whatever business reasons, wages were cut, which cutting people's wages never goes well. Workers in response went on strike, and they ended up actually, this is kind of an example of destroying property, they actually blocked and destroyed rail lines. And so you can see in the picture here, they are blocking this railroad from being able to operate. And this is problematic for the business because it keeps them from being able to make a profit. Their workers are unhappy. Not only are their workers leaving, but those that did stay are now keeping the trains from actually being able to move anywhere. The government called in the militia, and actually a bunch of strikers were killed in the process. The United States Army sided with the businesses, and this is problematic. So we actually have the American government fighting against the average people in this business. And so ultimately, over 100 people were killed in this strike. Another strike is the Haymarket Square Riot. And this riot is a little bit different. This one happens in Illinois in 1886. And this one is protesting police brutality in the city, in Chicago. Protesting, cops tended to, target poor people, blame poor people, and sort of bullying them around. And so in Chicago, they start protesting that. And at this protest, there were some anarchist speakers giving a speech, and an explosion went off in the middle of the speech, and 11 people were killed and over 100 people were injured during this explosion. 4 men, several of whom were actually on stage speaking at the time, were accused of setting off this explosion, and so they were wrongly convicted, and we know that because there is evidence that there's almost no possibility that they actually exploded these bombs because of where they were at the time of the bombs exploding. This, however, caused an anti-labor hysteria because the majority of the people at this protest were labor workers. They were laborers. They were blue collar folks who worked sort of maybe some skilled but mostly unskilled jobs. And the government and the media blamed the protesters for this explosion, and it sort of created this like anti-strike, anti-laborers, anti-union mentality, and so the unions sort of had to lay low for a little while to let this all blow over. So there's an activity on Haymarket that you can do right now. If you want to do that, you need to read the documents and respond to the questions, and this is really getting at the nitty-gritty and big picture. I want you to keep in mind, how did this affect how people thought about the poor, how people thought about working class people, and how people thought about unions, because obviously the goal of this is to protest police brutality, and was that successful? Whose side is the government on in this whole event? The next strike we got to look at is the Pullman Strike. This one happened in Michigan in 1893. A bunch of workers were laid off. Being laid off means it's not firing, it's saying we don't have enough money to keep paying you, so you need to leave, but if we have enough money to hire you back, we will. Eugene Debs, he's a famous socialist at the time. He will become really relevant when we get into the next period. Eugene Debs led a wildcat strike, and this is basically going after anything that you can go after. They stopped the rails, and eventually the government stopped the strike, but this was after a long time of basically stopping any Pullman car. Pullman was the company, so they're stopping any Pullman car that's on the railroad, doing whatever they can to stop it. And wildcat means destroying the cars, ripping things up, and you can see in this picture that it got pretty violent. So again, we have a Pullman activity, and so we want to know, how did the public respond to this? What was the public's reaction? And big picture, how did this influence the way labor unions were seen during this time? The last one, and there's also a video linked on my website as well, is on the Homestead Strike. And this one has to do with our dear friend Andrew Carnegie. So Andrew Carnegie had Carnegie Steel, was sort of based in Pennsylvania, and this occurred in 1892. So the Homestead factory was a factory owned by Andrew Carnegie and was run by Henry Clay Frick. Carnegie was pretty intense about public opinion, wanting to make sure that the public didn't turn against him. I think he knew that he was actually outnumbered. There weren't as many robber barons like him, and so he actually wanted to find a way to pass the blame. And so Henry Clay Frick is his manager, essentially, of the Homestead factory. And so Carnegie wants to use Frick as his scapegoat, basically. Oh, Frick's the bad guy. And so Frick is the guy that he puts in charge of cracking down at Homestead. Carnegie is known as a strike breaker. He doesn't have unions. He doesn't have, he's all about the yellow dog contracts, no unions, do whatever it takes to succeed. But he also has this like weird obsession with public opinion. So at the same time as he's really intense, he's also super conscientious of having his public image. So Carnegie Steelworkers protested production demands. Basically, Frick, who is essentially Carnegie's puppet, Frick keeps upping the demands. You need to produce X amount by the end of the day, and that amount kept going up, and that was getting intense, and the workers began protesting this. So Frick, doing what his boss, Andrew Carnegie, told him to do, refused to negotiate with the union that was there and ended up locking all the workers out. If they wouldn't come to work under their conditions, then get out. And he decides to hire scabs, essentially, to come and replace them. In addition, he knew that the union was a pretty aggressive union, so he hired protection. When these new workers tried to enter the mill, there was a conflict. So he hired basically a hired militia to come and protect these men that he is also hiring to come in and replace the union workers. So it's actually kind of sketchy, which is why you should watch the video. But basically, these guys come in on a boat, and they come in on a boat, and they're coming up the river, and they're trying to do it really secretively, like get these scabs in without the villagers and the people that live at Homestead. Homestead was a factory town, where people lived in the town and worked in the town in the factory, and were paid in script, etc. So he's trying to sneak these guys in. They're being protected by a militia, and basically a battle breaks out right there on the shore of the river just outside the factory. Ultimately, the strike failed and the union disappeared. And at the end of this, anybody who was many people died. A few people died in this little battle that takes place. But it's hard. People eventually have to go back to work. You can't strike forever, and so they needed to go back to work, and they were allowed to come back to work if they disavow or stopped being a part of the union. So the strike ultimately failed. The union disappeared. It was a success for Frick and Carnegie, but it was, sort of this huge loss for the labor movement and for workers around the world. It wasn't super great for Frick because as a result of this, there was an assassination attempt on him, and people tried to kill him. They missed, but I'm sure that was important. And apparently Emma Goldman is part of the planning of Frick's assassination. So there's also a Homestead Activity. And so also thinking about in this one, how did this event impact public opinion? What are people of the time saying about Homestead? Another major event that you should know about is the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. This happened in New York. There was a fire at a shirtwaist factory, and a shirtwaist is a type of shirt. It came together really tightly at the waist, and it was a shirt that women would wear in the late 1800s, early 1900s. In this factory, there were really terrible working conditions. One of the things that's available to you is a documentary on this event, and women were, locked in on their floor to prevent them from using the bathroom. They worked many, many hours. They actually went on strike prior to this event, and their strike resulted in some change, but very little change, very little improvement. And the fact that they went on strike before this event is really significant and important, because they go on strike basically telling the world the conditions in which we work are terrible. And then months later, there's this terrible fire in their factory. Some other things, there was only one elevator coming in. Some things you might not realize is because of this laissez-faire government, there's no reason for businesses to spend money unnecessarily. So why would they spend money on on money to protect their employees, to promote safety, etc., when when they don't have to. So these women are working on sewing machines all day, sewing these shirtwaists. They're sweating. If they cut themselves using the needle or whatever, if they break a needle, that actually came out of their pay. I mean, the conditions were terrible. And if they cut themselves, they wanted to cover it up because they didn't want anybody to see them. They didn't want to slow down. They didn't want to get caught slowing down, that type of thing. It was pretty terrible conditions. So in addition to that, there's only one elevator, because why have two elevators? We don't want to spend extra money on that. The fire exit that was built certainly is not up to modern day code, and actually during the fire it collapsed under the weight of all the women that were fleeing. And this is largely because there were no fire codes passed by the government to tell them that you actually have to have a fire, like, a fire exit, a ladder coming out of your building that can hold the weight of all the people that would need to be able to get out of this. So many female workers, this is an entirely female story, or floor of workers, many female workers perished. I believe it was in excess of 100 women by burning to death or jumping out of this, I think it's on the 8th or 9th floor of this building, jumping to their death. Interestingly, their bosses were on the floor above them, but they got a heads up about the fire before their employees and fled the building and left the women to burn. And this is really important. This actually sways public opinion a lot, because they remember these women. These women were on strike for months before this, saying the conditions in which we work are terrible. And there was an open funeral for all of these women, and people had to come and claim the bodies, and it was pretty terrible. And you can see here, and the nets that the fire department had couldn't actually catch the weight of these women jumping from the 8th story. So these women would jump down to these big hoops and nets and other things that are intended to catch these women, and they would just fall through. So these women, most of them jumped to their deaths. So it was pretty terrible, and this is a real picture from the event of women on the street and police officers and everybody looking up, unable to help them. Oh, and the fire trucks the ladders on the fire trucks weren't tall enough to actually reach the story that they were on. So now in New York there are fire codes that require trucks to be able to reach a certain height. So there is a 51-minute documentary on the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, which is available on my movies page, so make sure that you go ahead and see that.